We are going to be talking about absolute and comparative advantage, and these are economic terms. These are what economists believe to a large extent determines what production happens under the conditions of free trade. So if we have free trade, the countries that produce a product generally have a comparative advantage in producing that product. This economic topic, or how we calculate comparative advantage in particular, is gone over in this module. There are no readings associated with this module, and we are just going to go over some examples from Ricardo giving comparative advantage for a two-country case. Absolute advantage and comparative advantage differ. Absolute advantage is the country, and we're going to be talking in the country case here, two countries. A country is said to have an absolute advantage if it can produce a product at the lowest cost. Lowest cost results in absolute advantage. Comparative advantage differs from absolute advantage in that it's the lowest opportunity cost. The country that has the lowest opportunity cost is the one that determines the comparative advantage. So comparative advantage will not be the same as absolute advantage. It can be in certain cases, but will not always be the same. Absent trade barriers, economies of scale, and all the examples that I'm going to use here do not assume any economy scale or transportation cost differences. The country should specialize in what they have their comparative advantage in. So the country that has a comparative advantage in producing, say, corn, should produce corn. I'm going to give a couple of examples here of absolute and comparative advantage for a two-country case, two-product case, and these come from Ricardo. Here's the simple table that Ricardo used. We have two countries, England and Portugal, and each country has a resource, and they are going to produce two products, cloth and wine. Now we're going to talk about the numbers in that sheet and what they mean. Both England and Portugal have 1,000 resources, and those are some physical unit. You could think of them in dollars, but they're actually some physical unit that are used to produce either cloth or wine. Both countries have 1,000 resources. It takes, in England, 100 resources to produce one cloth. So England can produce 100 or cloth, 1 unit of cloth with 100 resources. On the other hand, it can produce 1 unit of wine with 110 resources. Portugal is actually the opposite in its production. It can produce one cloth with 110 units of resources and wine with 100 units of resources. Now we'll focus on which of these countries have an absolute advantage in producing cloth and wine. And this is a very simple comparison to make. England has the absolute advantage in producing cloth because it takes less units of resource to produce cloth than Portugal. England can produce 1 unit of cloth with 100 units. Portugal, it takes 110. So England has the absolute advantage in producing cloth. Portugal, on the other hand, has the absolute advantage in producing wine. It can produce wine with 100 units of resources compared to England with 110. So in this case, England has the absolute advantage in cloth production. Portugal has the absolute advantage in wine production. When we have the case where countries have the absolute advantage in the exact opposite product, we also know the comparative advantage. In those cases, comparative advantage follows absolute advantage, but I am still going to go through the example of how you would calculate comparative advantage in this case. But again, if England has the absolute advantage in cloth, Portugal has the absolute advantage in wine, comparative advantage is going to follow absolute advantage in that case. Here's the calculation of opportunity cost, and again we have to calculate opportunity cost to do a direct comparison of comparative advantage. We're doing this for cloth, England and Portugal, and you see this written on the right hand side of the screen. England's opportunity cost of cloth production is 0.9 wine production. To produce one cloth, they have to give up 0.9 wine. And you can see that calculation by the division of the resources for cloth and wine production. On the other hand, Portugal's opportunities for cloth production is 1.1 wine. For every cloth that Portugal produces, they have to give up 1.1 wine. All right, England has the lower opportunity cost. It costs less wine production in England. Therefore, it has the comparative advantage in cloth production. I have now erased the calculation of cloth production's opportunity cost and comparative advantage, and I'm going to do it for wine production. Although already in the two-country, two-variable case, we should know that Portugal has the comparative advantage in wine production. It has to happen by default. Here is the calculation of wine production's opportunity cost. 1.1 cloth for England, so England's opportunity cost for wine production is 1.1 cloth. Portugal's opportunity cost is 0.9 cloth. So, in this case, Portugal has a comparative advantage in wine production, and you see that here. All right, so England has the absolute advantage and comparative advantage in cloth production. Portugal, absolute and comparative advantage in wine production. Now, to show that trade will result in a better outcome for both countries, we're going to assume here, as you see listed on the right-hand side of the screen, that both countries want an equal distribution of cloth and wine. Why that happens, just let's say it does happen. So without trade, each country could have 4.76 units of cloth and wine for a total of 9.52 in both countries. How did we result in that 4.76 for each country? We took the resources in each country and divided by the cloth and how much it took to produce one cloth and one wine, resulting in 4.76 units in each country for a total of 9.52. If we allow trade, 10 units of cloth will be produced in England, 10 units of wine will be produced in Brazil. They can trade. Each country would then have 5 units of each, and they would be better off. They would have more units of both cloth and wine in both countries. In this case, trade would make both countries better off, as it will in all of these examples. No matter what example you run, trade will make people better off in these sort of simple examples. Now, you may be wondering, well, I selected an even distribution. It doesn't have to be the case, but the even distribution makes these examples pretty easy to show. I'm now going to give a second example, and I've just changed the units that it takes to produce cloth and wine in Portugal. Now, at this point, if you haven't looked ahead, you might want to just work this out for yourself, and then we will go over the example. It's pretty easy to calculate these, but just work it out for yourself, and then follow as I go through this example. Portugal has an absolute advantage in both products. It costs less to produce both products in Portugal. But we are now that doesn't mean that Portugal has the comparative advantage in both of those, and we're going to make the calculations now of comparative advantage. England has the comparative advantage in cloth. In England, it takes 0.91 wine to get one cloth, versus in Portugal, it costs 1.13 units of wine to get one cloth. Given that England has the comparative advantage in cloth, England should specialize in cloth production. I'm not going to show the comparative advantage calculations for wine, but it's the reverse. Portugal has the comparative advantage for wine production, and Therefore, it should specialize in wine production. So, if we have no trade, and again, I'm going to assume that both countries want the same number of cloth and wine, England could get 4.76 units of each. Portugal could get 5.88 units of each. Portugal gets more because it takes less units to produce both in that country. So, for a total across those two countries of 10.64. Now, if we allow trade, we could produce 10.64 units of cloth by having England produce all the cloth and Portugal producing 0.64 units. That gives us 10.64. So if we do that, we have our 10.64 units of cloth that we had originally with no trade. If that happens, Portugal could produce 11.74 units of wine, and that is more than the wine that would exist without trade. Now, those two countries could adjust their production, but overall, if we allow trade and specialization, both countries will be made better off. I have one final example, example 3. I have again adjusted the resources it takes to produce cloth and wine in Portugal. You again might want to work this out before we go over the answer here. In this case, Portugal has an absolute advantage in wine production. It takes less units in Portugal to produce wine than it does in England. Both use the same units to produce cloth production. England has the comparative advantage in cloth production. In England, it costs 0.91 wine to get one cloth. Portugal, it costs 0.95 units in wine production to one cloth. England produces cloth. You would have sort of expected that result because of Portugal having the absolute advantage in wine production and England and Portugal requiring the same units to produce cloth. I'm going to again assume that both countries want an equal distribution of cloth and wine. Without trade, England could have 4.76 units, Portugal 4.87 units. Across both of those countries, each country could have 9.63 units, 9.63 units total across those countries of both cloth and wine. Now we're going to give an example where wine, 9.52 units of wine is produced in Portugal and another 0.11 units in England to get our 9.63. We've done all our wine production. England's going to then produce 9.88 units of cloth. We have more cloth than without trade. So we are better off. And again, we can change the distribution and both countries will be better off. So if we allow trade, and there are certain countries with comparative advantages, or there's differences in productive capabilities across countries, if we allow trade, we will allow specialization, which will lead to more production and more wealth across the countries. This is why we economists really like free trade, because of the benefits from specialization. Again, that idea was crystallized by Adam Smith back in his book Wealth of Nations back in 1776. There are caveats to the analysis that we've just done. One is that transportation costs are not included. So if we had transportation costs between those countries, that would serve as a barrier. Transportation costs play big in agricultural commodities. In particular, one of the big differences right now, and we will have a module on this, is transportation cost differences between the U.S. and Brazil in moving soybeans. This analysis also did not include economies of scale, economics of scale. We assume that no matter how many units you produced, it cost the same number of resources, it took the same number of resources. That will not necessarily be the case. The existence of economies could change this analysis, and often make benefits of trade larger. The final thing, and this is a big one, is that trade requires trust between countries. If we don't have that trust that the other country is going to be a supplier of the goods that we need to us, then we will be much more skeptical of free trade. I have 2 review questions here. Just calculate who has the comparative and absolute advantages between England and Portugal. You do not have to make the comparisons of if you have equal production here. I just want you to tell me who has the comparative advantage in this case that you see before you, and then go to the second review question and do the same. We have now completed this module on comparative and absolute advantages, and this will come to play later on in the semester, and actually we will be dealing with this next week when we look at soybean and corn production in the U.S. versus that in Brazil.